Apple Knocker Radio.
Hello, sir. How are you doing today?
I'm well. How are you, my brother?
I am doing really well. I thank you for very much for taking the time to talk today. I'm excited to get the word out about your upcoming book. And so I think the most sensible way to start introducing people to, before we get into your book specifically, can you talk a little bit about your personal, because you have a unique childhood, and how your life brought you into such a storehouse of esoteric, hermetic, occult knowledge?
Well, I guess it's been a long time. I guess I've been studying this stuff kind of my whole life. Since I was a kid, I've had a keen interest in history, mythology, occult and esotericism, religion, theology, witchcraft, anthropology, sociology, since I was a kid. And I guess, since I could really get into reading, maybe fifth, sixth grade, I started, looking into these subjects more and more. That being said, my mother had been an occultist, a witch, a practitioner of witchcraft or Wicca. It can't really be too much more specific than that. Maybe ceremonial magic. I think she was a follower of Leo Martello was one of her favorite witchcraft, gurus or whatever. And she certainly was involved with the New York occult scene in the 60s and 70s. So that certainly, helped my interest along. She certainly encouraged me, at least not to get involved with the occult or witchcraft, but certainly to study and understand these things, to study mythology and magic and these systems. I mean, she bought me a tarot deck when I was like 11 years old because I asked her to. I remember her looking at my first Aleister Crowley books when I was about 10 or 11 years old. I didn't buy them, and I'm pretty sure my mom told me she was not going to buy me Aleister Crowley books when I showed them to her, but I remember looking at them at Barnes and Noble for sure. But yeah, I mean, I'm actually a high school dropout. I was kind of a wild kid. I've spent time in jail. I've spent time in rehab. Had kind of a rough life in my teenage years and my early 20s.
Do you think, and obviously this interview isn't about plumbing the shadows of your past, but do you think that the way that you were raised, the metaphysical, existential, philosophical outlook that you were raised in, like you just said, your mother was a practicing occultist in these various traditions. Do you think that affected or led, I don't want to say led to, but do you think that impacted the challenges that you then had?
Partially. Let me clarify. I was born in 81, and certainly by 84, and where I have memories, my mom was no longer involved with the occult.
Oh, okay.
So growing up, my mother was not involved with this, but she had been involved with this during the 60s and 70s, most likely up to the late 70s, early 80s. And around that time is when she started to get out of it, is from what I can tell.
Okay.
A lot of this is, my mother was growing up. My mother actually, in many ways, although she encouraged some of my occult studies, also warned me about the dark side of the occult and was very wary about, like, some of her friends who I know were witches, their relatives who are witches babysitting me. She had some issues with that, but maybe that's because she had made that mistake before.
That's just really fascinating because, like, somebody like
So-
me, I come at this completely from an outsider perspective, right? It's like, to me, it's like studying a foreign culture. Like, I mean, it's not my world, but it's like really interesting because that, like, you grew up in that world. That is your world. That is your home in a sense. You know, like
Indeed.
you feel at least a little comfortable in there, and
Yeah,
so
and
that's just really interesting to me.
certainly I was raised to, like I said, have an interest in our ancestral religions, you know, whether it's Celtic or Germanic or Greco-Roman mythologies and gods and other cultures. My mom's brother is a bit of an Orientalist and a Taoist and things like that. So, and my great aunt, it was a Buddhist, a Zen Buddhist. So, you know, and my grandparents, my mother's parents were you know, World War II generation people. They were bohemians, you know, for people who were born in the 19 teens and 20s, they were fairly alternative people. I was not raised a Christian, although I am a Christian today. I was basically raised by my mother in a kind of a hippie new age fashion of religious syncretism, where there's truth in all faiths and religions, and but with this general knowledge that my family comes from both Catholic and Protestant backgrounds. But of course, before that, they were pagans of some variety, right? So yeah, knowing about ancestry, whether it's religious or even in a secular sense, like historically, is very important in my family. Knowing about lineage and such, and genealogy. And my mom definitely influenced that. My mom would say things like she would envision God as multi-headed and multi-armed and taking the attributes of Yahweh, Jesus, Vishnu, Buddha, etc., etc. You know, that's kind of where she was at.
Okay.
I think, you know, she wasn't a Satanist, at least not when I knew her.
Right. Okay. No, that's the cool thing about that is that it puts you in a position to answer a question that I've always been curious about. So we're talking today about your book, which is a study of the occult architecture of New York City. And before we get into the specifics of that, the general question I've always been curious about is why these groups go through so much trouble to create these things in the first place. Like, I've always tried to understand, is it simply a display, like, hey, this is our belief system and here it is? Or do they really believe this stuff has like actual properties? I guess what could be called magical or whatever it is. Like, do they really believe that by erecting these, and I'm not saying this isn't, like, I've got no horse in this. I'm just curious, when they erect these things, are they believing in their minds like we are actually committing like a magical act that is going to affect the world?
I think sometimes, and sometimes it's what people call coincidence or synchronicity, that, you know, or an egregore is created where certain happenstances just fall into place and that they all kind of relate to each other. But I think it's a mixed bag where there is intention sometimes. And certainly people in the occult milieu, whether it's Freemasons and the intention of a cornerstone laying ceremony, and you know, the astrological alignments that might be going on at the time that they do a cornerstone laying, to you know, when somebody might do a magical ritual, the time of year or the time of day or the phase of the moon. I do think certainly we know that the ancients built edifices and monuments and buildings and cities, and laid out cities with a spiritual intention. And of course, we know that the ancients dedicated cities, not just temples, but whole cities, to tutelary deities, just like we have patron saints of a city or a country or a state today. In ancient times, they had the same thing where like Athens is obviously dedicated to the ancient goddess Athena or Artemis, Minerva. I think it's a mixed bag, to answer your question again.
Okay. Yeah, to my understanding, in India, it's still a relatively common practice that they set their cornerstone with some kind of traditional spiritual meaning. I can't remember the details of it, but to my understanding, that's still common practice there with any new construction.
Well, in my book, Esoteric New York City, my forthcoming book, should be out before the end of the year, or at least I'll finish writing it before the end of the year. I don't know how long the publication process is going to take, but I do go into cornerstones and particularly Masonic cornerstone laying ceremonies. Those are pretty much the only cornerstone laying rituals or ceremonies you see in New York City over the past 200 years. And
do you know if that's still observed? Is that still done?
Oh yes.
Yeah.
The last ones in New York were certainly done in the 20th century. Not too many Masonic buildings have been built since the mid 20th century.
So you're referring specifically when Freemasons build a new lodge, they lay a stone at a specific point?
Yeah, the cornerstone in the northeast corner of every Masonic edifice, whether it's a Shriner temple or a Masonic lodge or a Scottish Rite temple. The northeast corner, there's a cornerstone where there's a ceremonial ritual where corn, wine, and oil are placed on the cornerstone, and mortar, of course, is applied. And very often these cornerstones have like a plaque or an engraving that says the date of the foundation, the beginning of the building of the edifice, etc. So those are all over New York, and they're not just on Masonic buildings. All the Masonic buildings have them, but there's other buildings. Any buildings that Masons were involved with, whether they're Masonic or not, have them. And yes, if you study the dates, they pretty much all line up pretty close to what we could call, astronomical events or celestial holidays or Sabbaths or whatever, feast days, stuff like that.
Do you, well, I assume this is probably a stupid question, but are those going to be listed and discussed in your book?
Oh, yes. I do a complete study of like, oh, hey, look how close in proximity this is to the rising or setting of the dog star Sirius, or look how close this is in proximity to the Masonic feast days of St. John the Baptist or St. John the Evangelist, which are obviously Christian feast days as well. But the feast days of those two St. Johns are the most important Christian feast days to Freemasonry.
That's actually a really interesting thing, and I'm glad we kind of accidentally stumbled into it, because when you talk about a lot of these things, like your book is about specifically looking at occult artifacts, constructions in New York City, a lot of people like just associate occult evil, but that you are a Freemason, or at least you were a Freemason. I don't know exactly where things begin and end in those terminologies, but and so this isn't like it's not an exploration of evil, it's an exploration of spiritual religious practices as they have been represented in archaeology in New York City, right? Would you say that's correct?
Correct. Well, the book is primarily, I'd say it's the occult and Masonic art and architecture in New York.
Okay.
And I do a little bit of archaeology, but not so much with this book. I'm going to talk a little bit more about Native American studies and archaeology in another book project that I have coming that we can talk about another time when I get my ducks lined up on that one a little bit more. But so yeah, I'm going into buildings with art and architecture that have occult themes. So Masonic and other, let's say, esoteric fraternal organizations and religious, their buildings often are discussed in the book. But corporate buildings and governmental buildings, civic, municipal buildings, and religious structures that have theological and esoteric and mythological themes are also mentioned in the book. So I pretty much run the full gambit of investigating symbolism on the buildings and statuary and murals and mosaics of Gotham City.
That's fascinating stuff, man. What do you think, can you remember off the top of your head what the oldest edifice is that you would be discussing?
Well, the oldest edifice in New York City is an ancient Egyptian obelisk, kind of generically known as Cleopatra's Needle, or the Central Park obelisk. And it's the only original ancient Egyptian obelisk in New York City. I think it might be the only real ancient Egyptian obelisk in the United States.
So it was constructed there, or was moved from Egypt?
It was moved from Alexandria in 1880 something.
Wow, really?
I detail all this in my book. It was primarily done by Masons, the Grand Lodge of the State of New York, and the U.S. military. And many of those Masonic brothers were servicemen in the military, and some of them had been serving in Egypt, and there were some American diplomats in Egypt, and it worked out with the Ottoman Khedive. And I'm paraphrasing the story from memory, it's all in my book, but that they got the Khedive to gift them one of these obelisks that had been, it wasn't originally in Alexandria. The Egyptians had moved it to Alexandria. I think it was in Heliopolis. I can't remember. It was in front of a temple that Ramses, I think, built, or Tutankhamun built. And there's two of them. And the pair is actually in London. And was given to London. And I forgot what they call it. I think they call it in Cleopatra's Needle in London as well. I've never visited that one. And so that's the oldest edifice. Now, it wasn't built in New York, but it's an edifice that was moved, transported, and they had to build a special, apparatus to erect the obelisk.
How big is this thing?
I mean, it's gigantic. It's tons. I can't even remember all the stats on it. It's tonnage, man. I mean, it took serious manpower and horsepower. I mean, they set up like railway trestles in the streets of New York and put it like on a railway car. Like the Vanderbilts helped with this. And they had to close down Vanderbilt's railroad to get it off the ship, to put it on a railroad car and put it on these tracks. And then they shipped it across like Fifth Avenue. And then they built this whole like almost like a bridge or a trestle through Central Park to get it across all the grassy knolls and everything to the spot where it is, just behind the Metropolitan Museum. And then they used this special like machine that they built, like a trebuchet to like flip it up on end and put it.
Wow,
it was a crazy engineering feat that members of the U.S. military and the Grand Lodge of the State of New York were involved with. And all the characters in that story, all their names and their bios, and all the details of the history of that story of how the Central Park obelisk got to New York is all detailed in my book. I talk about all the obelisks around the city and what they're about. And
what is the general meaning of an obelisk? Why are they so common?
Well, they became popular as like funerary, mortuary monuments, for the dead, as the grave markers and such. I guess in like the late 1700s and or mid to late 1700s, I would say. And this is right after Napoleon was in Egypt, so everything, Egyptology was becoming more popular amongst Freemasons, and Egyptian symbolism was becoming popular in Freemasonry. There was new rites of Freemasonry coming up that were based on Egyptian themes. And because the obelisk was this Egyptian monument, it started becoming this popular, like I said, mortuary, funerary device or grave marker, particularly for Masons when they died, but also for rich people in general. The Egyptians didn't use it like this. The Egyptians used them in pairs always to mark the entrance of temples, much like pillars or columns. And they would usually be inscribed on the shaft with, prayers or invocations, dedications, to the monarch who had them built or whatever. And there's usually prayers to deities. The one in New York, I believe, was engraved by Tut, one of the kings, Tut, pharaohs, or one of the Ramses, I can't remember. And it's got an invocation to Ra, Amun Ra. And it's a very solar oriented device. The obelisk does have some symbolic symbolism references to the golden phallus of Osiris. That Osiris's phallus was cut or taken away by his evil brother Set when he was killed, and when Isis resurrected Osiris, she recreated his phallus as like a golden object or whatever, and that the obelisk is like an image of that. It also is like the rays of the sun. If you think of the pyramidion as like the center of the sun and beams of light coming down, rays of light to earth, or God power from on high coming down to earth. The obelisk represents all these things. I think as a funerary device, it's like a conduit for the soul to move up to heaven. So they became popular like that, and they're used in Masonic symbolism quite a bit because of that.
Man, that's just always been fascinating to me. Like in a ancient culture like Egypt, where any ancient culture where, they didn't have the exact kind of technology and resources that we have now. And yet they were willing to exert so much time, effort, and resources to something like these obelisks. That's just what's always been fascinating to me, because unless we're going to write them off as stupid, which I don't want to do, I'm not willing to do that. It begs the question of like, what were you getting out of it? You know what I mean? Like there had to be some purpose to it.
Yeah, well, it's just like any edifices today, churches, I guess. People have a natural inclination to be creators and to shape their world around them. I guess that's
to direct the consciousness up towards high, up towards God.
Right.
Creation.
And that consciousness coming down to us, with the whole, we're made in the image. We're the little g gods who are creating on earth, whether it's through family and creating children, more humans, or whether it's through, as humans. I think that's our job as creators.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's fast. So, all right. So obviously a lot of the stuff that is in New York, a lot of it is Masonic origin, as you just said. But what are some of the other influences that pop up, or are there other influences that pop up significantly?
Well, I would say that mostly what you see is a neoclassical or Beaux Arts is what it's called in architecture. That's a theme, a reoccurring theme throughout the book, is that most of the buildings and statuary and monuments fall into the Beaux Arts or neoclassical styles or schools of architecture. And, this implies a lot of mythological themes, not always, but very often, and statuary and things like this. So whether it's, like I said before, whether they're Masonic buildings or other fraternal religious buildings, or whether they're municipal buildings, you see a reoccurring theme of Beaux Arts, neoclassicism, and a reoccurring theme of mythological themes. And I would say that with that reoccurring theme of mythology and legends or whatever, and theological or biblical themes, you see personifications or allegorical personifications of virtues and concepts. So, liberty, Lady Liberty, or Columbia, the personification of the American Republic, or the personification of the concept of liberty, is actually, is a goddess, is a female personification of liberty, is a goddess that we call Columbia here in the United States, like Columbia movies or records. Some people call her Lady Liberty, like the Statue of Liberty, which I go into quite a bit in the book.
Oh, yeah.
But she is an ancient Roman goddess, Libertas. Libertas is an ancient Roman goddess of manumission, of freedom, of freed slaves. And the Statue of Liberty, whose story and history of how she got built and how she came to New York and how Freemasonry plays into that and how other organizations play into that story. I tell that whole story in my book as well. And she, Lady Liberty, is a reproduction of this ancient Roman goddess, Libertas.
Wow, really?
Who in American Republican iconography is known as Columbia. And very often we see her wearing a red Smurf cap, which is called the Phrygian cap, or sometimes known as the Liberty cap. Now, there's a little bit of a conflation there, because the Phrygian cap is not the Liberty cap, but I can explain that, and I explain that in the book. The Liberty cap in ancient Greece and in classical times was called the pilus, and it was a conical cap.
Okay.
And it was a felt conical cap. And that was a symbol of being a freed slave, of manumission.
Huh.
A Smurf cap or a Phrygian cap, which was common amongst the Thracians and the Phrygians and other Persian Indo-European tribes, was in Greek times just associated with being a foreigner, not the Liberty cap, okay?
Okay.
So the pilus, which is a conical cap, is the Liberty cap of manumission and freed slaves, right?
Okay.
And the Smurf cap, the Phrygian cap, is like the cap of foreigners. So then fast forward to Roman imperial times, foreigners are being enslaved by the Roman Empire, but very often foreigners are becoming the new citizens when they are freed from slavery. So when they're freed from slavery, they're given the Liberty cap, but because they are not real Romans, ethnic Romans, they're given the foreigner cap. So the Phrygian, the cap of the foreigners, the Smurf cap, is conflated with the conical pilus cap of liberty. So today we conflate the two and call the Smurf looking cap the cap of liberty, or the Phrygian cap the cap of liberty. And we've kind of forgotten about the conical cap of liberty, but you know, they're just related. It's kind of maybe splitting hairs, over complexity of where this device or this symbol came from.
But the Statue of Liberty's like crown is a descendant from that idea?
No, so that's a different idea. So
okay.
The ancient goddess Libertas, she was either shown in iconography wearing the Liberty cap or the Phrygian cap, or she was shown holding the Liberty cap and giving it to a freed slave. And when she was giving the cap away, she would usually wear a tiara, which was typical of classical goddesses. And if you look at the Statue of Liberty, underneath the rays, she is wearing a typical classical Greco-Roman tiara that a Roman or Greco-Roman noblewoman or goddess would wear. And out of that crown or tiara are 7 rays, which are called 7 rayed. It's called a rayed nimbus. This is from the books about it. The 7 rayed nimbus. And the 7 rayed nimbus is actually not historically associated with the goddess Libertas. The 7 rayed nimbus, which are the 7 rays that are coming out of Liberty's crown or tiara, that nimbus or rays, they're associated with the god Apollo or Helios. And there was more Helios, I guess. And if you think of one of the 7 wonders of the world was the Colossus of Rhodes, which was a gigantic, colossal, brazen statue of the god or titan Helios, who was a personification of the sun, of the solar orb. And he wore a 7-rayed crown, just like Lady Liberty does. Now, Bartholdi, Auguste Bartholdi, the artist who made and designed the Statue of Liberty, he did design the statue after the ancient Roman goddess Libertas, but he also said he designed it to look like the ancient Colossus of Rhodes.
Oh, wow!
So he kind of mixed the way the ancient Colossus of Rhodes, which is a statue of a male deity, Helios, the way that statue looked, like its stance and its rayed crown, he copied that and put that on basically a classical depiction of Liberty, goddess, with a tiara, and the tablet is more kind of Republican iconography, not really Liberty goddess iconography. But a lot of people don't know this. She's her ankles are shackled, and the chains at her ankles are broken. Most people don't see that image of the Statue of Liberty's feet. Most people also think that the Statue of Liberty was a gift to the United States by the French government because of our allies, because we've been allies with France basically before they were a republic, right? Since the American Revolution, when they gave us help to fight the English. But the reality of that is, relations after France became a republic weren't always as friendly as the French Republic wanted, or some in America wanted. And some people say because Bartholdi, the artist who made the Statue of Liberty, was a Mason, and because most of the American Statue of Liberty Committee, the group that was tasked with getting the Statue of Liberty brought to New York and getting it erected in New York and building the pedestal that it was put on top of, the committee, those were all Americans, and they were all Masons for the most part. So a lot of people believe that like it's a Masonic gift that has to do with the Masonic connection to both the American and French Revolution, and it's like a Masonic French nod to the American, Masons, blah, blah, blah. And that may have something to do with it a little bit. But officially, it was gifted to the United States in commemoration of the Union victory in the Civil War and the emancipation of slavery and the declaration of the Emancipation Proclamation. That's why it's a statue of Libertas, the ancient Roman goddess of manumission, of freed slaves.
Man, that's cool.
Yeah. So it's kind of like a forgotten reason. A lot of people think, oh, it's for the immigrants, but that's an association that came later as well.
Huh. That's so you mentioned that it was based off of the Colossus. Are there reliable historical records about what the Colossus looked like? Do they actually know that for certain?
No, I mean, they know it was Helios. I think that's.
Okay.
I think that's it. I think the oldest depictions of it maybe go back to the Ptolemaic period, but maybe not. Maybe it's only medieval period. They certainly go back to the medieval period depictions of the Colossus. I'm a little hard pressed to say they're earlier than that.
Okay. So, there's a really rich tradition of Jewish Americans in New York City. So do they have any notable or significant archaeological designs that are based around, Jewish religious system, spiritual system?
Yeah, there's some synagogues that I'll be covering. One of the older German synagogues down the Lower East Side has like a zodiac and some pretty interesting mosaics. I forgot the name of that synagogue. I don't think I wrote that chapter yet, so it's not as fresh in my mind. But I know I'll be covering it. Yeah, there's an apartment building in the Bronx, which is going to come. Most of my book is Manhattan, but I do cover some of the outer boroughs in an appendix. And actually, one of the first co-op apartment buildings in the Bronx, New York, was built and started as a cooperative by German and Russian, I believe, Jews who were socialists. And, it's a red brick building, apartment building, but it has some like pretty overtly Masonic symbolism, like squares and compasses and, like Masonic trowels, like very operative Masonic symbolism, no all-seeing eyes or, mythological neoclassical stuff there. But like I mentioned, the Lower East Side Synagogue, there's certainly some interesting zodiacs in the mosaic, which goes back to like ancient, some of the most ancient synagogues and Jewish temples that they find in the Levant, in Israel today and around the Levant today, have all this, kind of pseudo-pagan Judeo imagery. So,
well,
yeah.
they seem to my, ignorant outsider perspective, seems to me like the Jewish faith is a little more comfortable with like mysticism overlapping with the mainstream faith and like Christianity. A lot of mainstream Christians are really bothered when you start overlapping with things like the zodiac, etc.
Right.
But it seems to me, as just an outsider, that the Jewish faith has always been a little more comfortable with the overlap, because they have the Kabbalah and all of these things. They're not considered antithetical, I guess, to the mainstream belief system.
Right. Well, even like when you mentioned Kabbalah, like even the most orthodox Judaism has Kabbalah and has Zohar. They reserve it for married adults, whereas like more, let's say, liberal or heretical forms of Judaism, like Sabbateanism, allow children and young people to study Kabbalah. So whereas Christianity, more orthodox Christians, like you said, tend to not have any mysticism for anybody, even adults. And it's only like more alternative people. But, and I might, this might offend some more mainstream Christians, but really we need to question, in like an anthropological sense, the terms monotheist and polytheist. Okay, let's throw pagan out, because pagan is a Latin term that means country folk and the country religion. Okay?
Is it really? I didn't know
technically, like look into etymology of pagan, paganes. It means of the country. Oh, it's like barbarian, right? Barbarian is like, oh, they got beards and they talk like sheep, like goats, ba ba ba. So it's the same thing with pick me up. Where am I talking about, Jeff?
we were talking about monotheism, polytheism,
right?
And,
so pagan.
mysticism.
So pagan is the country guy with the beard who talks like ba ba ba, the barbarian. So it doesn't even have a real implication in its etymology and its word origin with multiplicity of deity. So let's talk about monotheism and polytheism, right? Polytheism, the belief in a pantheon or multiple deities. Polytheists, although they believe in multiple entities, they always believe in a supreme one deity or set of deities over the pantheon or hierarchy of deities. So one might think of that as kind of like pseudo-monotheism. Then when you study the monotheistic tradition with the Abrahamic faiths of Judaism and Islam and Christianity, we have angels. And why can't we think of the angels as lesser deities? So there's God, the creator, the Father, who's a supreme deity. And, ancient Jews actually did believe in a goddess, a consort of Yahweh. Yeah. And now this is a controversial thing in the history of Judaism. And if you read the Old Testament, I mean, it's kind of like, that's part of like how the Jewish people or Israel are falling out of favor with Yahweh, is because they get too comfortable with the worship of Yahweh's wife and the angels. And a lot of the time the Bible refers to this as Baal worship or Asherah worship. They'll say, oh, they went to the high places and set up poles in the groves to Asherah, which is a reference to the mother goddess, Mother Earth, as like a heresy within Judaism. And, maybe making that goddess above Yahweh is the heresy. But the fact that the ancient Jews had both is maybe bespeaking a more complexity of what monotheism and polytheism is. And basically what I'm saying is what we call monotheism is just an evolution of thinking out of polytheism.
Huh.
Basically, Judaism, the original monotheism, is polytheists choosing we're only going to worship the chief male deity.
But they accept that there are other deities. They have just chosen to focus on the one.
They've relegated those other deities in the pantheon to angels, saints, Mother Mary, sometimes maybe, and demons and fallen angels. And
Right,
some
wow.
of them are fallen angels and demons, and some of them are gods or angels. Whatever,
Yeah, that's, you mentioned the saints, and that has always, I mean, like if you look, I don't know if it's common now with mainstream Catholics, I'm not sure, but like if you look at back in the day, I mean, they would talk about the saints basically, after they died. To me, it seems like they're talking about like a deity, like almost like a minor god of sorts, or at least like a spiritually potent thing that is actually like still active. Like they pray to the saint, as its own empowered being. And so, yeah, I know, it's just that whole thing has always been really interesting to me. And I've never really understood why today, when you try to talk about mysticism, esotericism, hermeticism, all these things, it's so often met with this idea that like you must be up to something shady, when it's like, it seems to me like it was always kind of the tradition for a long time within Christianity and Judaism.
Well, that gets back into what you said before about occultism, and like the implication, people have a false implication that it means something dark or negative. Occult means that is which is hidden. So certainly much dark side spiritualism, most, what I would call Satanism or evil dabbling in witchcraft is done in the dark, is done hidden, is occult. But not everything that's hidden or occult or private is dark and evil. So, I mean, look at, the temple, the Solomon's temple, the Jews, they're holy. The holiest place of the temple was private. I think even in a Catholic church, the tabernacle section of a Catholic church, which would relate to the holiest of holies in the Jewish temple, which is where the Ark of the Covenant was a place where only the high priests and the Levites could go, only like one time a year, a certain time a year. So something being hidden or private, to me, isn't necessarily an implication of evil.
Isn't in all four gospels, I believe, at least a couple of them, doesn't Jesus, isn't he like outright quoted as talking about secret teachings that he holds for his immediate disciples, or I forget exactly how it was phrased.
I can't put my finger on the exact scripture to cite it, but yeah, he does. Yes, absolutely. I mean, mysticism, I think Christianity is mysticism. I think actually it's heresy out of Judaism, if I can call Christianity partially, at least, a heresy out of Judaism. I'm not saying in toto it's that, but at least at one point in the history of Christianity, it was a heresy out of Judaism. And in that sense, I think that it was mystical. I think it was taking the mysticism of Judaism to its natural, logical, its logical evolution.
That's really interesting.
I mean, because, Judaism outside, like Torah doesn't talk about a Trinity, okay? Talmud doesn't talk about a Trinity. Talmud is rabbinical commentary on the Torah or Tanakh. So the Old Testament doesn't talk about Trinity. But Zohar or Kabbalah does talk about the Trinity of God. And Christianity talks about the Trinity of God from a very early point in history. So I do think that, yeah, Christianity is based on some very mystical streams within not only Judaism, but within the greater Middle Eastern milieu, because there was still polytheistic cults going on at the time. Of course, there was the Baptist cults that followed John the Baptist and stayed with John the Baptist. There was the angel worshippers, the Yazidis. So that's a very ancient pre-Judaic tradition, really.
That's fascinating, man. And it's always seemed like it's important to me and impactful to me, because anytime people talk about these things, and obviously you as a Freemason know that it all gets roped into, it gets too simplified. And number one, that's negative because decent people get demonized, which can have actual real life effects on their existences, which isn't cool. But it also, it robs people of an appreciation of the actual complexity of the thought processes behind why people would go through such efforts to, create these spiritually motivated or esoterically motivated constructions, and it's like, yeah, obviously there's good and bad in everywhere. And some of it has some kind of nefarious origins or intentions, but that doesn't mean it all does. And I just feel like that misunderstanding, it robs people of a richer understanding of the world or ability to examine the world, and also has actual negative effects on people. Like, how many people's lives have been tarnished because they believed in something a little unusual from what other people believe in, and they're automatically called evil, or you know what I mean? Like, it just seems like a really destructive misunderstanding to me.
Yeah, I've certainly, we've talked about it, not on this show, but we've spoken about how because of some of my beliefs spiritually and politically, I've had Masons attack me. And at the same time, I've also had Christians who shared my political beliefs and some of my spiritual beliefs attack me solely because I was associated with Freemason. And that I must be some agent of whatever globalists or Satanists and must be, not telling the truth about what I believe or blah, blah, blah. So
in the brief time I've been running this channel and talking about these topics, it's actually been a relatively brief time. Even I have had a couple encounters with people, like one when I talked to Miguel Connor, who's the Aeon Byte Gnostic radio host. I had just a couple email exchanges, and I'm just like, dude, number one, Miguel Connor's a really cool dude, and I won't have people bad mouthing him. But number two, I'll talk to anybody. Like, I'm not scared to talk to people. Like, I don't understand what people are so afraid of. Like, it's okay to talk to anybody, man. It's like, chill out.
I totally agree. Like, I'll talk to anybody. I'll talk to Satanists. I might not agree with them. I'll talk to anybody from any religious political tradition, and that's the way it should be. I think that's what America is all about, right? Like, that's what a free democratic republic is all about, is that we can all sit and talk and debate and disagree with each other and still shake hands and worship together, or agree to disagree and not worship together, and eat dinner together and be good people to each other regardless if we disagree. But yeah, I think a lot of people are on some end all be all, one size shoe, it's all got my way or the highway. I don't know. So right. Yeah, I'm very open to talking to anybody. I might not agree with everything, but I'm super open.
It's just right. It's silly, man. It's really make any sense.
Well, you're right. There's almost like, say, in the patriot movement or in the more kind of conservative milieu, or even in the conspiracy milieu, you'll see there's kind of a debate where you hear like Christian conservatives say, this republic was founded on Christian values and the founding fathers were Christian. And then another side will say, no, the founding fathers were all Masons and Rosicrucians and occultists, and they weren't Christians and they were deists and all this stuff. And again, we're getting into this, it's either one way or the other.
Right.
And really what it is both. And that they were all Christians, and many of them were deists, and some of them Christian and some of them non-Christian deists, and many of them were Masons and Rosicrucians, and some of them were more on, let's say, the light side of that magical, mystical, whatever it is, occultism, and some of them were on the dark side. I mean, I don't know. I'm not going to point, too much fingers. I mean, Benjamin Franklin was involved with some like eyes wide shut stuff.
Right.
We
And
know
that's
that.
fact. That's historical fact. We know
he
that.
was involved with it in England with the Hellfire Club, Sir Francis Dashwood's sex cult. It was a satanic orgy cult. They were doing black masses mixed with orgies. Benjamin Franklin was involved with that. His house in London, they found human remains. Now, he was a doctor. At the time, surgeons did employ grave robbers to get cadavers, to do autopsies, to study, blah, blah, blah. So maybe it's just that he had cadavers, including child cadavers, in his basement in London because it was part of medical studies. Maybe they're sacrificial victims.
Right,
Some people.
No, sorry. Go ahead.
No, some people think so. I don't know. I don't think we'll ever have the proof one way or the other what they were.
And that's basically my attitude, because it's like I've heard that about Benjamin Franklin. I've like you, I have no idea what the origin of those human remains are. But it's like, I mean, that's the thing. That dude also, how much did he do for regular people? I mean, he was truly and seriously dedicated to this idea that all people should have access to education and all this stuff. Like I believe he helped start the first public library in Philadelphia with his own books. Like him and the other guys got together with their own books and were like, hey, let's have the public make sure they can get their accesses. So I guess that really, his story sums it all up, because it's like, yeah, there's weird stuff that he was involved in, but it can't be that simple, because he was a good dude in terms of helping people out and wanting to make this American vision reality, and, giving out books and education. Like, I don't know, man. It's a complicated thing, and I think it's not good when people oversimplify it.
I totally agree, and I mean the bottom line is the founding fathers were men. They were mortal men, and all mortal men have faults, including me and everybody else. And nobody's perfect, and people make mistakes, and people do the wrong thing. So every man's life, in my estimation, certainly mine, is a mixed bag. Right. Of having done bad, even evil, and having done good. So, I mean, even if the guy's a Satanist, well, he invented bifocals. So, like there's some credit that's got to be given for positive. There. Right. I mean, yeah, they own slaves. People go on and on about that. The left goes on and on about that. But they also created the first working democratic republic since ancient Rome. That they took the best parts of the ancient stuff and the best parts of the Magna Carta, and they formed some new thing that was, in my estimation, still the best charter of governance. The Constitution and Bill of Rights and the Declaration are the still best charters of governance that the world has seen in the past 300 years. Nothing has come better. The Declaration of Rights of Man isn't better with the French, and the UN's, declarations or whatever are not superior. The Constitution and Bill of Rights that my great-grandfather ratified for the state of Virginia, that's the superior document in my estimation. But
your great-grandfather did, huh?
My fifth great-grandfather, is the one I can document the best, which got me membership in the Sons of the American Revolution. was in the Virginia militia, and his name was Colonel Benjamin Wilson. And it's my maternal 5th great grandfather. He wrote a letter to George Washington in like 1774 or 75 or something about, what he was doing, basically fighting Indians who were working for the British in the Virginia frontier, which is now West Virginia. And he was one of the main settlers of that part of Virginia, which is now West Virginia. And he not only fought during the Revolution as the commander of the militia out there, but he ratified the Constitution and the Bill of Rights for the state of Virginia.
Wow, that's cool, man.
Yeah,
that's really cool.
Indeed, thank you.
Yeah, putting this together, have you had any people acting like you're doing something spooky?
Well, not so much. I mean, I've been accused long before I ever started writing the book, in like political circles, like I said, or activist circles, that I was somehow, because I was a Mason, working for the dark side or COINTELPRO or something. Some of, I think some of the people in the Son of Sam research community might think that about me because of my Masonic affiliations. But not too much lately because of the book or anything like that, I would say. A lot of people don't know, what I've been up to in terms of intellectual pursuits. Anyway,
okay.
So,
yeah, man. When it's become such a crazy situation because everybody thinks everybody else is a disinformation agent. Like it happens all the time. It's just funny to me. It's like, because I'm not trying to marginalize, because that is a real thing, right? I mean, that actually does happen.
Absolutely.
But the extent to which it's like, damn, dude, not everybody is up to something. Like,
well, when you know you're not, and people are calling you a COINTELPRO confidential informant, or an agent provocateur, and you're not, or like a crypto Luciferian or a crypto Satanist, and in your heart you're not, it can be a little annoying to deal with. But I kind of have always looked at it as like, I was involved with those circles who were kind of critical of Masonry. A lot of people were, before I became a Freemason. So I knew getting into Freemasonry was going to open up a big bag of worms and controversy within the activist, political, spiritual milieus that I was part of, because there was enough of an anti-Masonic bend to some of those people that. So yeah, but not so much in connection to this book. No.
Yeah. So yeah, getting back to the book, I assume there's going to be other pictures in there, photographs.
Yeah. So my plan is to put out the book in 3 formats. Okay. So there will be a coffee table size version of the book, which will be like a hardcover, and will be like probably fairly high end, and will be very picture heavy, and we'll have, glossy pictures, sidebars with pictures and information, but also very academic and scholarly with citations and footnotes.
Okay.
But kind of like with pictures throughout, rather than a dedicated picture section. Then I plan on putting out a more academic, kind of standard paperback hardcover version that has like a picture section in the middle, and a lot of what might end up as sidebar material on the page will be in the footnotes only, and it'll just be more of kind of an academic version of the book and maybe scaled down illustrations. Then a version that is a pocket version, paperback, that has some pictures again, but not a dedicated picture section, but almost scaled down pictures throughout. and it will be a guidebook to do self-guided walking tours.
Oh, that's a great idea, man.
Oh, thank you very much. This is my wife's idea.
Oh yeah.
And walking, she's a collaborator, obviously, and she edits everything I do because I suck at writing and I suck at grammar. But I'm a great researcher, and I have a great memory and a great mind for connecting things and understanding things. But I'm not the greatest writer. And yeah, my wife helps me, and she came up with this idea. So it'll be maps and how to give yourself a self-guided tour. If you ever go to Manhattan, you could go, oh, let me go to Rockefeller Center. And you could spend 2 hours walking around Rockefeller Center, looking at all the statuary and mosaics and murals, and getting all the breakdowns of the esoteric meanings of it all. And, other than the kind of mythological and Masonic kind of esoteric themes, there's that we find in like the Masonic and municipal buildings and corporate buildings of Manhattan. Obviously, Rockefeller Center is a corporate complex. The Rockefeller family built Rockefeller Center as a part of the Standard Oil, operation, and all their other interests, I guess, in banking and everything else they're into. And there's a theme, and before I mentioned, Beaux Arts architecture. And what's interesting about Rockefeller Center is technically Art Deco. Everything is in the Art Deco style, including the artwork. But because the themes of the artwork and the statuary, although they are in the style of Art Deco, they're all of neoclassical themes and mythology for the most part. Not all of them, but the majority of them are. It's a fusion of the Beaux Arts tradition of neoclassical revival with the Art Deco school, which of course was trendy in the 1930s when Rockefeller Center was built. And a lot of the mythological or esoteric themes that you find in Rockefeller Center have a lot to do with the kind of elitist bloodline beliefs of the Rockefeller family, and some of the weird some of their family's weird clandestine political activities during the early part of the 20th century. So in terms of the mythological stuff, you have like, there's a mural at Rockefeller Center that depicts essentially demons falling out of heaven.
Really?
Which is a reference, of course, to the fallen angels falling from heaven and becoming Satan and the demons, right? Then there's another separate mural, and I can't remember the titles of all these or who the artists were right now. Obviously, the Rockefeller family commissioned all of them, but all of this is detailed in my book. And all of this information, the dates, the people, the places, will all be in my book, and it will all be academically sourced and cited. But I'm just going off of memory, and my memory is way better at the symbolism than it is this guy and his bio and blah, blah, blah. So there's another mural that is like, it's obviously like supposed to be the ancient gods bringing technology and illumination, arts and sciences to man. Then, of course, we know very famously above the ice skating rink, there's a statue by Paul Manship, who was famous in Untermeyer, Son of Sam research. Paul Manship has a statue at Rockefeller Center of the gilded Prometheus falling from heaven. Now, Prometheus, of course, stole the fire of gods or illumination and gave it to man. And this is the mythology of Prometheus mirrors the story of the fallen angels in the Old Testament and Book of Enoch traditions.
Lucifer, the light bringer, right?
Where Lucifer is as a title of Satan, or Azazel, the fallen angel, meaning the light bearer. Also, the fact that in the Book of Enoch, where the term Lucifer isn't used, just the names of the angels are used, like Azazel, the chief of the fallen angels, who is known by the title Lucifer or light bearer. But him and the other fallen angels are known to have taught man sciences and arts, you know.
Really?
Yeah, if you read the Book of Enoch, they teach man how to make weapons and how to do sorcery, root working, and astrology, and all types of stuff, animal husbandry, like everything from good sciences, abortion, beautification of the eyes, like makeup, like all types of different stuff.
That's all in the Book of Enoch?
Yeah, that the fallen angels taught this stuff to man. Also in the Book of Enoch, some of the archangels that are not fallen, like Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel, teach man, Enoch specifically, about like astrology and how to, like, you know, follow the stars and read the stars. So again, implying that the knowledge of these occult sciences is not in and of itself evil, but maybe the application and how one uses these sciences is what makes it good or bad. And that certainly the fallen angels seem to be of more the diabolical nature or the darker nature of it.
Right.
So getting back to Rockefeller Center, it seems obvious that the Rockefeller family are associating their family with the stories of the Sumerian Anunnaki, or the gods who came to earth and created man and taught man how to build civilization. And the other theme is, you know, the fallen angels are those same entities, the Anunnaki, or some of those Anunnaki are the fallen angels of biblical lore. There's also this theme of the Titans and like the new gods, and like the new young gods are taking over from the old gods, the Titans, which of course is in Greek mythology. And, you know, you think about like the Rockefellers as titans of industry, right? And then you start thinking about this Titan imagery at Rockefeller Center, and it's almost like they're saying that we're the new gods, the new titans of finance, of industry, the nouveau riche, taking over with, you know, J.P. Morgan Chase, Rockefeller interests from the old Rothschild European banking interests. You know, that's what I get from it, at least.
Was the Book of Enoch widely known at that time?
Well, the Book of Enoch was first translated into English in the late 1700s by a Scottish Freemason who traveled to Ethiopia and found the original Ethiopian copy of it. Now, the ancient Hebrew translations of it were not known until 1945 when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found.
Oh, they were part of the Dead Sea Scrolls, huh?
Well, that's really, in my estimation, what makes Enoch 1, or the first book of Enoch, almost legitimate canon. That there's historical evidence that the ancient Israelites, at least some sects, let's say Orthodox sects like the Essenes or the Qumran community, who were the ones who compiled the Dead Sea Scrolls, that they retained the Book of Enoch, at least Enoch 1, as part of the Old Testament. They also had the Book of Jubilees amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls, which the Book of Jubilees basically talks about the same stuff that the Book of Enoch talks about: the fallen angels interbreeding with human women, and why the flood came, because the Nephilim are the offspring of the fallen angels with human women, also known as the giants or Nephilim, that they were, doing blood sacrifice, they were doing cannibalism, they were doing warfare and all of these things, and that's the real reason that the flood was brought, Noah's flood was brought. So I believe that those were very important books to ancient Judaism that were important in Jesus' time, because I believe in a canonical book. I believe the book of Jude is a There's a canonical book. I can't remember if it's
there is a book of Jude in the Bible.
Okay. In the book of Jude, it's a New Testament book, right? A New Testament book of Jude?
I'm not sure.
Okay. There's a New Testament book, and it might be the book of Jude, I can't remember, where Jesus references the book of Enoch.
Really?
Or the book of Jubilees, which, like I said, are related subjects. And then again, in 45, when we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, it was confirmed that the Dead Sea Scrolls weren't a Christian apocryphal book that only Slavic Christians and Ethiopian Christians had, but that was in Jewish scripture and Hebrew scripture. So I believe it was important to ancient Judaism, and that they just slowly pushed it out of Judaism. Because I can't remember if it's the Sadducees or the Pharisees, but one of them believes in angels and one of them doesn't. So the group, whichever one doesn't believe in angels, they would want to edit the book of Enoch and the book of Jubilees out of the book of Genesis, because that's the part of the book of Genesis that deals the most with the angels coming to earth and dealing with mankind. It also has to do with, the relation of creation to God, because why are the angels fallen? The angels are fallen. Lucifer, or Azazel, I rather call him Azazel, or Shemyaza, his real angelic name. He refused to bow to the creation of Adam. God the Father, Yahweh, commanded, bow to Adam. He's made in the image of me. And the angel said, we're made of light, we're made of fire, seraphim, cherubim. Obviously, we're created, but we're closer to you, God the Father, than this man of mud, of sand, of dirt. And God the Father said, your pride, your arrogance, this is your sin. And this is why they fell. And then they solidified their demonic nature by, again, transgressing with human women. Now, that's transgression with the human women and the relation to the Nephilim. Remember, the Nephilim are called the giants in the Greek translation of the Old Testament. Nephilim in Hebrew means those who have been lowered. So if you think, the angels are fallen, they've been lowered, and they've bred with human women, so their genetic code has been lowered down as well. So they're children of those who have been lowered. Well, why are they called giants? Well, in Greek, giant means those who are from the earth. So those who are lowered, Nephilim, it's almost the same, giant, Nephilim. Those are from lowered could mean a reference to the earth. In Greek mythology, the giants are the offspring of Gaia and the demon god Typhon, who's essentially like a Satan, an evil demon who's like the god of the titan of whirlwinds and storms, and he interbreeds with Gaia, Mother Earth, the personification of the earth, And that's what creates the giants.
Hmm.
And of course, the giants are very much associated with the Titans or the old gods. And the new gods or the young gods, the Olympians, right, led by Zeus, or Zeus, Jupiter, which is very similar, dare I blasphemy say, to Yahweh, the Jewish God. He rebels against Saturn and the Titans and the old gods, and they kill off the Titans and the giants. So it's very similar to then in the book of Enoch, God punishes the fallen angels and locks them in Tartarus. It says this in the book of Enoch, that that the archangel Michael or Gabriel binds the fallen angels in Tartarus, the Greek word for the underworld. Well, Tartarus, right, is Hades, another word for the underworld in Greek, which is also a name for Pluto, the god of the underworld, Zeus's evil brother, who could be synonymous with Satan or Set, you know, the evil side of divinity, the dark side of divinity. So again, back to Rockefeller Plaza and Center, they are the Rockefeller family through the iconography of these fallen angels and these Anunnaki and these Titans and these new gods. They're as if they're claiming themselves to be associated with these ancient deities, and maybe they're from these bloodlines of these ancient Anunnaki or Nephilim, that they, whether that's true or not, that they believe it, and that they're special people. And that's why they're the ones who are ordained to be so important in the world today, right? And that they believe themselves to be this, and that they're telling the general public this through the artwork that they commissioned at Rockefeller Plaza. The other theme is like the Rockefeller family's proclivity towards socialism of both the left wing and quote unquote right wing varieties. And what I mean by that is there is overtly, let's say, socialist and Marxist imagery in some of the murals and bas reliefs at Rockefeller Plaza. There's one bas relief, I can't remember the title, that's, I think, dedicated to the builders of Rockefeller Plaza. It has some Masonic symbolism in it. And one of the workers is clearly giving the socialist salute. And there's definitely hammer and sickle symbolism repeated multiple times throughout Rockefeller Center. There was actually imagery there that was deemed, actually before I get to that, there was a mural by Diego Rivera in Rockefeller Center that was very controversial because he was a known Trotskyite and member of the American Communist Party and member of the Mexican Communist Party. But he, you know, rubbed elbows with Nelson Rockefeller and the New York elite. So the New York elite, although, you know, big time capitalists, the Rockefeller family, certainly seem to have a proclivity towards socialism.
Well, it kind of makes sense because you got to figure if in their vision, if they were to establish that socialist system, they'd be running it. And the people running socialism aren't really socialists because, you know, you're running the show. So you could kind of see how that's, to them, that might not be a contradiction. They might have viewed it as the chance for the ultimate control.
Right, because they're not really capitalists, at least not in the laissez-faire Adam Smith sense. Adam Smith abhorred monopolies. And in Adam Smith's definition of capitalism or laissez-faire free markets, monopoly capitalism or crony corporatist capitalism is antithetical to the free market. So the Rockefellers aren't capitalists in the Smithian sense. They are corporatists. They are monopoly men. And just like you said, Jeff, monopoly men love centralization.
Right.
And they love a strong state. And it doesn't matter whether that state is left wing or right wing. If that state has a monopoly on the economy or a monopoly on anything, then the people who are involved with banking or industries who want monopolies would go, yeah, let me help the state get the monopoly because they're going to hire me to manage that system, or I'm going to run it for them anyway, de facto, because that's the way it was anyway.
Right.
And so, yeah, FDR, the Rockefeller family, the Vanderbilts, the Rothschild family, these people love socialism.
And it especially makes sense because if they truly believe that they are special, that they are like actually genetically special, like, or spiritually special, whatever it is, you could see from their perspective, because it would be like, dude, I'm better than everyone else. I know how to run this. Like if everybody would just chill out.
Yes,
like, maybe they aren't even actually like assuming this is true. All of this stuff is true. It wouldn't even necessarily mean that they're evil. Like they could just be really deluded and just so egotistical and thinking like I can fix everything, you know?
Right, like a Machiavellian paternalism.
Right, exactly.
We're just, children who don't know what we're doing, and they're these enlightened priest kings who will dictate and pull strings behind the curtain to make a better society. And in many ways, as much as I personally do think that they're evil and that their agendas are sinister, I think that they do believe that they're doing good,
right,
and that they do think that this is going to make the world better, and that population control and forced eugenics and sterilization, which are all things that the Rockefeller family has historically supported over the years and still do. I think they think this is a good, healthy thing for society and the earth.
Right. It's like, well, the road to hell, right? The road to hell is paved with good intentions, right?
Paved with good intentions, exactly. So getting back to the Rockefeller Center and the artwork there, there's, like I said, Diego Rivera had this huge mural. Now it was so controversial that the Rockefellers eventually had the mural covered up. But it had images of Marx. It had images of Lenin.
Really?
You can look it up. I can't remember the name of it now. Just look up Diego Rivera's mural at Rockefeller Center. It's got, esoteric, occult, mythological symbolism with like historical kind of Marxist Hegelian historical analysis in this like not abstract, but it's not cubist or anything, but it's like, it's just a people throughout history. And like, it's cool. It was very cool mural. It looks very cool. I like the art, but again, he was a known communist. Well, why was this guy, this Trotskyite who was rubbing elbows with the Rockefellers, why else were the Rockefellers so enamored with socialism other than what we just talked about? Well, historically, they are known, the Rockefeller family and other New York elite families and other New York Wall Street financial houses like Chase Manhattan, the Rockefellers, the Harriman brothers, or the Guarantee Trust Corporation, which would be Avril Harriman, who was the governor of New York, and Prescott Bush. They worked together at Guarantee Trust Corporation, and the the Brown Brothers, Harriman Brothers Corporation, and Prescott Bush's George Bush Jr.'s grandfather. They were involved with funding the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. And this is documented. I suggest looking into the book Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution by Anthony Sutton. Excellent work. It's all documented that not only did these Wall Street firms that the Bush, Harriman, and Rockefeller families were connected to, not only did they literally give Leon Trotsky, who is living in Manhattan, in the Lower East Side and in the Bronx in the 19-teens, they gave him thousands of dollars, a U.S. State Department passport, and let him leave New York on a ship with an entourage of like some couple 100,000 supporters. And they were stopped in Nova Scotia by the British authorities, who assumed that the passport was fraudulent. As why would a known communist terrorist who is exiled from his mother country, why would he have a passport from the U.S. State Department saying he could go to Russia? And they called up the State Department, and the U.S. State Department said, nah, let him go. And not only did he have all this money and supporters, but supposedly he also had guns and a bunch of rifles. So they were set up with guns, money, and passports by Wall Street elites who were connected to the Washington deep state at the time to set up Trotsky, to go back to Russia and formulate the takeover of Kerensky's provisional government, because there had already been a democratic, anti-czarist takeover, but the communists didn't take that over till later. That was, so, and at the same time, Lenin was in Germany, was set up by German bankers, and he was put on a train, an armored train car full of gold bullion from the Rothschild assets in Germany and sent on a train to Russia. And that's how he snuck in to formulate the Bolshevik Revolution. So it was set up by the Western financial Eastern establishment elites, in my opinion.
What would they have stood to gain by that?
Because like you said, if the Soviets were setting up a command and control monopoly system, it didn't matter if they liquidated all the corporations, because they don't. I mean, look, GE the Stalin electrified the Soviet Union with GE.
Okay.
The Soviet Union was industrialized by Standard Oil, GE, you name the corporate interest, International Farmer, you name the corporate interests at the time. They don't need the corporate names. If the state is taking control of the corporate apparatus, so what? The Rockefeller families and their corporate apparatus will just do business directly with the Communist Party. That's all.
Just good old-fashioned greed.
It's still greed, it's still monopoly. So as long as it wasn't hurting their pockets, like in the long term, they could go along with the liquidation of the corporations because it was still a monopoly. They would still have their hands in the pie. And that's documented. And then if you think about Lend-Lease, a lot of people think Lend-Lease started in World War II. Or no, a lot of people think Lend-Lease did start in World War II, excuse me. Are you familiar, Jeff, with the Lend-Lease program?
I'm not.
So the Lend-Lease program is during World War II, where we're basically subsidizing the Soviet Union as our allies fighting the Third Reich. Okay. So we're sending them International Forester, we're sending them, Henry Ford, everything, parts, GE, Standard Oil, everything. International Harvester, tractors, everything. Okay. It's all, John Deere, everything. It's all coming from us. And this was already going on during Lenin's time, right? But during World War II, under Stalin and FDR, it really picked up because there's like a legitimate reason, right? Because they're fighting the Nazis, or at least there's a so-called legitimate pretext. Well, that Lend-Lease program continues after 45, all the way up to the Reagan administration. So the whole time we're fighting proxy wars during the Cold War with communist nations that are being funded by Moscow and China and Cuba. We're funding the Soviet Union still. And we set them up in the first place.
That's so bizarre.
And it was the Rockefellers and the Bushes who were part of that, and the Harriman family.
So they really were funding both sides.
And then they were funding the Nazis. So you have, like, by 1930s, by the rise of the National Socialism in Germany, Avril Harriman and Prescott Bush are directly funding the rise of Hitler and the National Socialist Party in Germany.
Man.
And then Standard Oil is all over subsidizing the Third Reich. How is the Third Reich turning coal into diesel fuel? With Standard Oil technologies. And Nelson Rockefeller, he was big time corporately involved with Standard Oil down in Latin America before World War II. And of course, we know the whole Nazi connection to Latin America, both before World War II and after World War II, right? So what had happened is in 47, right around the time when Israel becomes a nation state, Israel, the Zionists, go to Nelson Rockefeller and they say, yo, we got a dossier on you and your family, on how you and Standard Oil and and Chase Manhattan and all your corporate interests were involved with funding and supporting the Nazis, and the concentration camp systems were part of this, and blah, blah, the forced labor, blah, 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 was all part of this corporate apparatus. And we got all the dirt here on you, Nelson, and your family. So we're going to put it out into the public and give it to the New York Times unless you get the Latin American countries, who at the time, a lot of the Latin American countries that weren't communist were fairly pro-fascist or had been pro-fascist, Pinochet, etc. And those governments, being Catholic and anti-communist and maybe a little pro-fascist, and having connections to Germany and the Third Reich, and not very pro-Jewish or friendly towards Judaism or Zionism, let's say, were like voting at the UN. They were voting against Israel. So the Zionist lobby said, yo, Nelson, you got all these corporate interests that are all connected to the Third Reich, or were connected to the Third Reich in Latin America. We're going to expose you and your family for all these connections and your double dealing during the war and before the war and all this, and your dealings with the rat lines and paperclip after the war. We're going to expose you for that, basically, unless you get the Latin American countries to vote at the UN for the creation of the state of Israel. And it worked. And they never put that dossier out there. So that's another Rockefeller connection to not just left-wing Marxist socialism, but also to right-wing, Nazi fascist style socialism.
So they'll play any side as long as they're in control. They'll play any side.
As long as it creates a monopoly where they can take advantage of it. Yep. And
that's pretty wild.
They hid this in the art of Rockefeller Center. There was another piece that had a motto that Mussolini popularized. And it had a very Italian fascist looking piece, frieze. And it was so controversial that they removed that as well and replaced that. So there was both a communist Marxist artwork at Rockefeller Center that was removed because it was too controversial for the general public. And the Rockefeller family had to, play, whatever, I don't know what you call it. And there was a fascist, particularly an Italian fascist image or propaganda image at Rockefeller Center that became very controversial for the general public, and they removed it.
Man, that is bizarre, man.
In the 60s. And there's still a couple, you could say maybe fascist and communist images still there, but the most overt ones were eliminated.
Were they destroyed or were they just stuck somewhere else?
Yeah, no, Diego's mural was destroyed, and I'm pretty sure that the fascist iconography was destroyed. And I cover all this in the book again and more. I cover, there's at Rockefeller Center, there's stuff that has to do with Atlantis. There's imagery that has to do with that, which maybe plays into Platonian concepts of, Atlantis and the Republic, and Baconian concepts of the new Atlantis and the new Jerusalem here in the Americas being created. And there's a lot of interesting imagery just at Rockefeller Center. I mean, I wrote a whole chapter just on Rockefeller Center. Trying to think what else. There's a chapter on Grand Central Terminal and all the buildings surrounding Grand Central Terminal. There's a whole building about all the different lodge buildings, the Masonic lodge buildings, the Knights of Pythias, the Odd Fellows, the Knights of Columbus. There's Washington Square Park, Union Square Park. I do a whole history of the Tammany Society, or better known as Boston. What are they usually known as generically? The Tammany Society.
I don't
Tammany
know.
Hall. Tammany Hall.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Tammany Hall was actually a fraternal society that was not just centered in New York. Tammany Hall was a fraternal, a kind of a civic, patriotic fraternal society that was started in Pennsylvania, and it was very popular in most of the mid-Atlantic states in the decades just before the Revolution. And a lot of the people who were involved with the Sons of Liberty before the American Revolution, a lot of those agitators, those patriot agitators, had been members of the original Tammany societies. But during the war, it kind of went into hiatus. And then after the war, it comes back, and it's really prominent in Philadelphia, where the first society was, and in New York and in Jersey. But by the early 1800s and the 18 teens, I would say, the New York chapter of the Tammany Society is the most prominent, and therefore, then they kind of generically become known as Tammany Hall because of their their lodge building, and they're very much connected to the Democratic Party in New York, which at that time was the Republican Democrats, Jefferson's party. Now, in the beginning, the Tammany Society was very bipartisan. There was, let's say, Federalists or Whigs in the Tammany Society, and anti-Federalists or Democrat Republicans. But by the time of the Whiskey Rebellion, most of the Democrat Republican elements were becoming so pro the French Revolution and pro the Whiskey Rebellion, which was an insurgency that was inspired by the Jacobin French Revolution, that the more conservative Federalist, Whig elements like George Washington elements, they left the Tammany Society, and that all that was left was the more, let's say, left or Democrat Republican elements. And at that point, Tammany really becomes a vehicle for the Democratic Party. And then, like I said, the New York Society becomes like the most prominent one by like the Civil War period, or like the only one left. By like the end of the Civil War, the New York Tammany is the only Tammany Society left. And they stick around and are involved with New York City Democrat politics all the way up to the 1960s. Now, they lost their stranglehold on the city's Democratic Party by like the 1930s. And actually, FDR, as corrupt as he was integral in breaking up the Tammany corruption and monopoly on the Democratic Party.
He did that as president?
In New York. Oh, I think he did that as governor.
Oh, okay.
Before he was president, yeah.
Okay.
But they did continue on to the 60s, and they weren't liquidated until the 60s. And it was basically a part of the Democratic Party from the 1790s all the way up to the 60s. And
that's wild, man.
Yeah. So I go through a whole deep dive on the history of the Tammany Society, how it relates to New York politics, like I was just talking about, and the whole gangs in New York and that story.
Damn, man, that's fascinating, dude.
And how that's connected to the American branches of Weishaupt's organization, or the Bavarian Illuminati, because there seemingly is and I cite it, I can show you the documentation, that the New York Tammany Society and the New York Deist Society were suspected as being the American chapters and the New York chapters or lodges of Weishaupt's organization, or the Illuminati.
Wow. That's pretty wild connections there, man.
Yeah, and I am not like, I think there's a lot of info about the Illuminati and Weishaupt and the Illuminati, and the New World Order and Freemasons, and how these subjects connect to each other. There's a lot of information that's BS, totally bogus, hyperbole, exaggerations, just total crap. I am totally about clarifying those misconceptions and about showing what is historically documented about the connections between those concepts and groups.
No, that's awesome. I actually it was only recently that I learned that there was an actual historically valid Illuminati. I thought the whole thing was always theoretical. It doesn't mean I necessarily believed it wasn't correct. Like I'm open-minded, but I was like, okay, I thought it was all people looking at things and creating a theoretical concept. It was actually only recently that I was like, no, this was a real historically documented group.
A lot of the conspiracy researchers Some of them good, and I like their research, and some of them I think is crap. Have oversimplified what Illuminati is and the model of it, that you think like that they almost, one would walk away from it thinking like the secret society or the network of secret societies that's running globalism or the New World Order today or something calls themselves the Illuminati or calls themselves the Illuminati. And I don't think that that's true at all. First of all, the most secret elite society or group that's running the world affairs, the New World Order, doesn't even have a name, and we don't even know who's in it. And the most elite people like the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds and the Vanderbilts and the British royal family and the Dutch royal family, they're just scratching the surface of the true elites that are above them. And I'm losing track a little bit, but yeah, I'm losing track, buddy. Sorry, I fell off the ledge there.
No, it's all good, man. It's all good. We were just talking about how things get oversimplified with the Bavarian Illuminati and the
Thank you. So like, yeah, to think of it as like this monolithic thing that the modern elites are calling themselves the Illuminati is kind of crap. It's debunked. The fact of the matter is, there was a group that Adam Weishaupt started in Bavaria in the late 1700s. They definitely had an influence on Freemasonry. They were certainly involved with infiltrating Freemasonry. They definitely had an influence on the Jesuits within the Catholic Church. They're definitely involved with influencing and infiltrating Jesuitism within the Catholic Church. They were definitely, their Weishaupt's ideology, at least the secret ideology of the Illuminati, the inner core beliefs, was what I would call proto-Marxism. Actually, Marx basically plagiarizes parts of Weishaupt's theology, like the destruction of the nation, the family, and religion, directly is a plagiarization by Marx of Adam Weishaupt. Now, the lower degrees of the Illuminati were taught like libertarian republicanism, but the higher degrees were taught a more totalitarian utopianism, where they were like the elite masters, and it had this kind of proto-Marxism like I talked about. That was the inner core belief of Weishaupt's thing. So it definitely influenced Marx and later socialist totalitarian movements like fascism, National Socialism. We know that the Jacobins and the French Revolution were very influenced by Weishaupt and his thinking, and that many researchers believe that the Jacobins, the French Jacobins, were basically the French chapter of the Illuminati. So there's an influence by this group. Now, a lot of people think, oh, in 1776, you know, Weishaupt's organization is like found out by the Bavarian government, which is true. And actually, Weishaupt is exiled from Bavaria. But like most researchers, the story ends there, and they go off on other tangents about Masonry and Skull and Bones, which is a related secret society, and the Bohemian Grove and the New World Order in general. But the fact of the matter is, well, what happened to Adam Weishaupt after 1820? Adam Weishaupt moved to another German principality. I don't remember which German state he moved to. And he was protected by the prince or the king of that German state. He was kicked out of Bavaria, but he went to another one, Westphalia, I think. And he lived his life all the way from, I think I said a wrong date before. He lived his life all the way from the 1700s when he was born, and the 1776 when the Illuminati was founded, and then in 1778 when he was exiled because the Illuminati's plans were found out by the Bavarian government. Well, then after that, the story ends for a lot of researchers and they go off on other tangents, like I said. But if you study what happened to Adam Weishaupt, he leaves Bavaria and lives out his life till 1820, 1825. So that's a long time after 1776. So what's he doing in this time? He's purveying his philosophy and his beliefs. And what did Adam Weishaupt say? Other than infiltrate Masons and Jesuits, he said, we need to infiltrate all levels of civil society. We need to infiltrate the church. We need to infiltrate fraternities like Masonry, etc. We need to infiltrate the government and civics. We need to infiltrate education. And this was a big one. We need to infiltrate education so they could have control of the youth. And so the Illuminati still exists in a sense that it's an idea and that it had an influence on other groups, and that other modern groups that still exist, like Skull and Bones, are direct lineal descendants of the Bavarian Illuminati. So the Bavarian Illuminati or the Illuminati doesn't really exist anymore. And the New World Order elites don't call themselves that. But certainly the agendas of the global elites organizations like the Bilderberg Group or the Council on Foreign Relations or the Committee of 300, or maybe even a more esoteric one like Skull and Bones or Bohemian Grove, they seem to politically, socially be in line with Weishaupt and what the Bavarian Illuminati were trying to create. And all this funding by Skull and Bones connected family people and Rockefeller family people of both sides of the socialist political dialectic only bespeaks that they're into that idea, that there's some kind of ideological bend behind it that is related to Weishaupt and Illuminism. Skull and Bones is said to be, the Yale Society fraternity is said to be a chapter of a German fraternity that was at a German university that was brought here by the founders of Skull and Bones at Yale. Well, like I just said, Adam Weishaupt was actively involved, and the Illuminati in Germany was actively involved with infiltrating education and higher education, the university system in Germany. So why wouldn't the American branches of the Illuminati be doing that here? And of course, if you study American education, modern American education, Mon, Dewey, what's the other guy? Dewey, I'm trying to think. There's another famous American.
I know who you're thinking of. He's usually the guy who's given credit as the guy that started the American education system. Thomas Mann? Thomas
Mann is one of them.
Oh, okay.
I mentioned him.
Oh, you did? All right.
Yeah, there's like three of them. You know what? Hang on one second. Jamie! I'll ask my wife. Yeah, so there's three main educators who are given credit with developing modern American public educational system. And they were, almost all of them, inspired by the Prussian educational system, which was created in 1800s in Prussia, which was basically an educational system to create good soldiers. And, Prussia had one of the most militaristic societies in Germany at the time. And when it was brought to the United States by the Eastern establishment in the mid to late 1800s, it was applied not to create a good soldier like it was in Prussia, but it was applied to create good industrial workers. So what does that mean? It's about creating good cogs, good people who follow orders well, who fit into the greater machine, essentially. So really, the American public education system is based on illuminist, German, Prussian, totalitarian, socialist system of creating servile cogs or drones, at least in my estimation.
Right. Yeah. No. Yeah. That all, I mean, yeah. And I think the way you present it and the way you deal with it, I mean, that's tracking historical movements that can be, verified, validated, checked. And like you said, where all of this talk of history gets dangerous is when people start taking things and making too many assumptions. And that the problem is it muddies and discredits all of the valid stuff, and that's why I brought up, like, I honestly didn't know that there was a real historical Illuminati. I just always assumed it was all theoretical. And I don't think that would have been the case if I hadn't heard so much crazy stuff later layered on top of a lot of the things that I heard, and just made me assume, like, oh no, dude, this is all just theoretical. But it's like, no, dude, they were a real group. I mean, like, there are historical documents. We can read their historical documents, I mean, like, yeah, they were for real.
They certainly had their influence on the American Republic and the American Founding Fathers. I mean, it's historical documentation that George Washington knew about them. I mean, there's a famous letter that he wrote to an American preacher at the time. The American preacher sent General Washington a book about the Illuminati's infiltration of Freemasonry. And of course, he sent this book to General Washington, or President Washington, because Washington was involved in Freemasonry. And Washington basically wrote back, I don't doubt, quote, I don't doubt that the doctrines of the Illuminati and the Jacobins have come to the Americas. I do think that that's true, he said, but I doubt that that's had an influence on American Freemasonry. And I would say that at the time, he was probably right. And even for the most part, even today, it's probably right, because American and English or Anglo Freemasonry tends to be more conservative than French or main or continental European Freemasonry, which tends to be a little bit more liberalized, both spiritually and politically. But it's also naive to think that the Illuminati weren't influencing American Masonry at the time, because I think they were. So that's what George Washington said about him. Thomas Jefferson is known to have said that he thought that Adam Weishaupt was a great philanthropist. Maybe because exoterically, on the surface, Adam Weishaupt's kind of political philosophy was very libertarian and like Republican, very much the ideology that the founding fathers were professing, that Thomas Jefferson was professing. What Weishaupt was maybe even taking a bit further, because Weishaupt was talking about, abolition of slavery. Weishaupt was talking about the abolition of children from their parents. Weishaupt was talking about abolition of women from marriage, all types of things. So that's partially why I call him a proto-Marxist. But when we look at Jefferson in other ways, Jefferson published the first translation of the New Testament that omitted the miracles of Jesus. You can look this up. It's called the Jefferson Bible. And what's interesting about this and why it's connected to Weishaupt is one of the doctrines of the lower degrees of Weishaupt's Illuminati was that Christ should be taught as a secular, revolutionary prophet and not as a spiritual, supernatural Messiah, and all the miracles should be omitted. It should be like almost like how modern liberation theology, where they fuse socialism with Christianity or fuse Marxism with Christianity, almost like that, where he was like, let's use Jesus as a propaganda piece for communism, for socialist or proto-socialist ideologies. So Marx actually spearheaded that 80 years before, Weishaupt spearheaded that 80 years before Marx was born, So, yeah, it's deep.
That's
deep.
wild, man. That is wild.
We can write so many books about all this.
Yeah, dude, I'm gonna be looking this stuff up after we're done, because that's fascinating stuff, man. So before we close this out, I have let me just ask, number one, what's your best estimate on when the book will be going live? And number two, you've got your website, and I'm wondering what you intend to be sharing on there up to the lead up of the book's release.
Well, okay, so I'm guesstimating I'll be done writing the book before 8 months is up. So certainly before the year is up. But I want to say a good estimate is that it'll be done in 6 months. But, to give myself a little time, I'll say 8 months. But I'm not sure. I do see the light at the end of the tunnel. I know it's only a handful of chapters left, if that. It's probably less than that. Some of the material is probably going to get, that I haven't written yet, is probably going to get interjected into pre-existing chapters or into an appendix. The website. Now, the website, I kind of felt like, because I was putting myself out there publicly on your show and another episode, and on my buddy, our buddy Manny's show about the Son of Sam, that I should put something out there to attract people and to so I could basically get a mailing list together of people who are interested in my book. So I encourage anybody in your audience to go to my website, which I'm sure you're going to show on screen later, which is Esoteric Craig, one word, .wordpress.com. And they can go on there and they can just sign up and subscribe. And it just means that they'll be on my mailing list. And, if I put anything new up there, it'll get emailed to them. And I have you on my mailing list for when the book's ready. I will make an official announcement, obviously, on the website and through a private message to everybody on my mailing list. So I primarily set it up to be a conduit for that. I do have listed, as people can see, I have listed, courses, book and courses to come. So other than eventually putting out a book in both electronic and paper form, in both, like I mentioned, 3 different formats of both an electronic and a hard version. I set up the website to basically launch courses. Now, whether I'm going to be launching these courses before the book gets published, I'm not really sure. It might coincide with the book getting published.
And these will be courses in like esoteric history, esoteric ideas, stuff like that.
Right.
Okay.
So right now I'm formulating a course on Freemasonry, on everything. So on the history of Freemasonry, both the official story and the more esoteric mythological stories, and all of them, because there's not just one. And that course will also include the meanings of Masonry and the symbolism and, like I said, the history of it, how it was founded, the origins, all the way up through today, politics, how it relates to political stuff, how it relates to spiritual and religious stuff, how it relates to the Illuminati, how it doesn't, how it relates to the Illuminati, globalism, how it relates to other secret societies like Skull and Bones or the Bohemian Grove or to the Odd Fellows, and how it doesn't. So it'll be a very comprehensive course on Freemasonry. Basically, anyone will walk away from it being an expert on Freemasonry. They will blow most Masons away with their knowledge of the craft, even Masonic scholars.
That sounds fascinating, man. For sure.
I hate to toot my own horn, but I would say I'm one of the most knowledgeable Masonic scholars out there, although little known. And I hate to be egotistical because I'm not really an egotistical guy, but I know the material, a lot of the prominent Masonic scholars out there, and most of them are whitewash experts who are only really concerned with making sure that Freemasonry looks good. And although I'm not interested in making Freemasonry look bad or throwing Masonry under the bus, I am a proud Freemason. I will be a Freemason till the day I die, and once my spirit is gone to the other world, I will still be a Mason. No one can take that from me, whether I pay dues or get even kicked out of Freemasonry officially. No one can take the experience away from me. But people who will pay for this course in the future, this forthcoming course, they will walk away more knowledgeable than a 33rd degree Mason, or even the most erudite official, Grand Lodge, Supreme Council 33rd degree scholars of Masonry. You will come away with that level of education and deeper. And I plan on putting together maybe a course about the Illuminati, specifically about its history in America, which is actually an idea for a forthcoming book, because there's never been a book written about the Illuminati just in America, and particularly one that was scholarly and academic. And I think I'm the man who can do it. So that's a book that I've began not writing, but getting my research in order, the ducks squared away. Other than my esoteric New York art and architecture book, my next forthcoming book will be a kind of an autobiography mixed with an examination of the esoteric aspects of the Son of Sam murder case. Like I said, mixed with my personal story and how it relates to that case, and how the story of the Native American history of Yonkers and the Bronx, parts of New York, play in to my personal story and the Son of Sam story. So that's the next book, which I have a little bit written for. That I will, once the architecture book is written, I'm going to start promoting this other book. So those are my ideas for the website and the books. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get the courses out before I get the book done. I might be able to get the courses out like when I get the book done, like when I'm done writing, then I'll get the courses out as I'm getting the book published. Because my intention is not to seek publication. My intention is to self-publish. So my idea is I have to figure out a number of how much my first rip of all the different formats of the book is going to be, right? Mm-hmm. Like based on pre-orders and just general how much I think maybe I can sell or get rid of, right? And then I'm going to go to a private bookbinder, printer, and just say, look, this is what I want. Can you do this for me? And format it myself if I have to. So I don't know how long that process, once I'm actually done writing, is going to take.
Sounds that like a Kickstarter could be good for that. Have you thought about a Kickstarter?
Kickstarter? I don't even know what that is, bro.
Oh, dude, people, you should definitely look into it. There's another one. There's a GoFundMe, I think. No, I don't think that's quite the same. But there's a Kickstarter. So what it is like everything that you just said, you would just put it, you'd have a Kickstarter page, and you could take pre-orders ahead of time, but people would actually pay you, right? Which gives you the money to fund the production of the book. And so you're basically just funding it on the front end. And like I have a lot of my friends are big into role-playing games, and they buy like, modules and game systems through Kickstarters all the time. I mean, it's a very feasible way, a legitimately feasible way to raise money on the front end.
I'm gonna look into it. I might wait to take people's money until I actually have the product printed out and can send it. But I'll, take pre-orders in the sense of I know who books are going to, you know what I mean? Like right. you have 2 books reserved at least, Manny has a book reserved. So I don't know, but that's a great idea. And I appreciate you sending me in that direction. Really, I think I think the logistics are is our printers, aside from being able to fund it, our printer's going to be able to print what I want, the glossy page, the different formats, 3 different formats, scholarly text heavy, but also visually illustration photograph heavy. Because the coffee table version, which I call like the main version of it, I mean, I want like almost every page to have glossy color photography. That also may become an issue for me because I'm going to have to source some of that. So, there's public domain and there's a fair usage, but I might have to get around copyrights and trademarks with photos and things like that. So I might have to go and hire some photographers to go to New York and take some photos for me. I've had even some trouble where a couple of the pieces are so high up on buildings and the streets are so narrow that there is no photographs of these pieces. And you can't see them on Google Earth because they're blocked by trees or because the angle of the street is too narrow and they're too high up on the building, like I said. Luckily, some of them, there's descriptions that I could work from. So there's been all types of weird stuff like that, like trying to get all the information about the different buildings and what the iconography and statuary is on the buildings. I've had to go into such, old records. I mean, I'm not just using, modern books. I am, but I'm using like old 1800s newspapers, books that came out in the 1800s and in the early 1900s. stuff that the New York Historical Society put out, all types of just crazy resources.
Man, yeah, you got a story in the research of it alone. You can tell its own story, man.
For sure.
But yeah, dude, that's awesome, man. I'm so looking forward to the book. So looking forward to all the stuff you're putting out. And thank you for taking the time to talk today. I really appreciate it. And keep me updated on how the book progresses, man.